Every step of the way, it was an active political decision which involved the US Congress, often of both parties, not to change the rules or not to apply existing rules to new financial innovation. The parts of the banking system that were regulated found it quite profitable and in fact desirable to shift their assets and liabilities in ways that took advantage of the relatively unregulated shadow banking system, and therefore able to engage in transactions and for a while make quite handsome returns. That was the incentive after all, by operating in that part of the banking system which was less regulated than the traditional part of the banking system. It was not hugely controversial at the time politically to keep doing what we were doing. So that's the sense in which going into the crisis, the foundations of the crisis, which in a sense depended on this hugely increased leverage that banks were undertaking, was made possible in the United States and in some other countries. Interestingly, not in countries like Canada and Australia, which had different regulatory environments and a very different structure of the banking industry. In order to do a fundamental restructuring of things like financial regulation, which requires a really deep and serious look at some of the issues that are going to face us as we go forward in the 21st century in a highly globalized economy, you do need more of a consensus over what policy changes are necessary. And while it's always easy in the American system to keep policy from changing, it usually takes the active participation of both parties to make significant new policy change. Not only just to enact the law, but to then continue it so that it gets implemented in regulations and so on. That requires more of an agreement between the parties than we have today. And so I actually think that, and other scholars do also, that the current environment actually makes lasting constructive policy change less likely than it would have been 15 years ago, when it wasn't very high to start with. I think something had to be done, and fairly quickly. I think it's also true that it probably would have been better to do things one way than another. And as I say, people could disagree about what would have been the best long-term solution. But I think quick and decisive short-term action was definitely needed. And under those circumstances, I think it's probably true that had we not done something quick and decisive, the crisis probably would have been worse. We ended up choosing what people call the bailout approach, which probably in the long run may not be the best way to do it. But had we done nothing, or had we done a very slow process in which we did a very orderly, judicially driven, litigation-oriented bankruptcy thing, which had we had the luxury of a more long-term perspective, we might have, in fact, gotten away with it. My guess in an emergency situation, that would have been very difficult to do.